Hi everyone, I'm Henry from the North Pennines National Landscape, as Claire said. I'm a conservation officer there, and most of my time is spent working on this project, which is Adders Up. It's a project that's funded by the National Lottery Heritage Fund and Branch Out, which is a part of funding from Northumbria Water as well. And we also received some funds from DEFRA and the Farming and Protected Landscapes Fund. So what's the project all about? It will run until 2026, and we're aiming to improve our understanding of the distribution of adders in the North Pennines National Landscape. Unfortunately, adders are now vulnerable to extinction in England, so it's quite an urgent issue for conservation. And aside from that, there are beautiful and charismatic and enigmatic species that we'd hate to see disappear from our landscape. We're also seeking to engage with local people and visitors to the landscape, landowners, land managers, to achieve some more positive outcomes for the species over the next sort of 3 years, 2-3 years. So as I say, we're aiming to establish a more robust data set showing where adders are in the North Pennines, and also to work with local community groups, wildlife groups, students, visitors, landowners, to raise awareness about their threatened status. Part of that is working to stimulate strategic habitat management around adder populations, but also between them to increase their sort of landscape scale resilience by improving connectivity. So part of that is directly funding bits of habitat creation work, providing advice on land management, but also facilitating landowners applying for funds through other sort of routes. We're also currently hosting a project in collaboration with the university, which has been really exciting. We've got a couple of researchers who have been collecting and sequencing DNA of adder populations across the national landscape. Again, this is focused more on the genetic diversity side of the conservation issue, so doing whole genome sequencing to try and see the extent to which adders are mixing or not, as it may be, and how that might be influencing their kind of resilience to disease or their ability to successfully have young, and all these issues which you see in any species when you start to get bottlenecking in the genetic diversity. So, a game of Spot the Adder. This is always a good one. I'll give you a few seconds. This is a moorland site owned by the Durham Wildlife Trust. They've just bought it a few years ago. It used to be a small grouse shooting operation there, and they've tweaked the stocking density already, and there's a management plan being written at the moment, but it's also quite a good site for adders. There she is. So that's a beautiful female. You can see she's got some scar tissue on her back there. So a little bit about identification. Many of you might have seen adders before. In fact, how many people have seen an adder? Is it? Oh, good numbers. Yeah, good. You've all been getting out there. So just in case you haven't seen one before, a bit about their identification. So they're the most northerly occurring species of viper that we have, and they're found across much of northern and western Europe. They're our only venomous snake, which makes them pretty exciting. Adult females can reach up to 60 to 80 centimetres long, whilst the males slightly smaller, an average of 40 to 50 centimetres at the upper end of their range. Those are just sort of guidelines, it does vary a fair bit. Both have a zigzag pattern along the centre of their back and a V or a kind of X-shaped mark on the top of their head. And the scalation on the top of the head actually varies from individual to individual. So you can use it to tell who's who, which is really useful for kind of capture and release and long-term monitoring studies. So yeah, as I said, they're variable markings. They also have keeled scales. So if you imagine the underside of a boat, that's kind of what their scale looks like in profile. The males are typically sort of grey and black or silver, whilst the females are typically light and dark brown, but again, it does vary, particularly when the males are just coming up to shed, they can look a bit darker. So the best thing to do is actually, the males kind of have a longer, thinner tail, whereas the females, it stays a bit thicker and then narrows in at the end, and the male has a little bulge on the thinner bit. But yeah, those are some important characteristics. That you also get melanistic ones, hence the name of the TV show, Blackadder. So here are two individual snakes. You can see in this photo that the scalation does vary quite a bit between the two. As you look at it more, you'll see the differences more easily. If you ever go to the dentist, they've got different names for all your teeth. Same with the scales on a snake's head. So you've got like a pre and post ocular and like a supranasal, and there's all names for each of the scales, and that allows you to kind of reference them when you're writing about the individuals. But essentially, the longer you look at them, the more differences you'll see, and we'll get a headshot of each snake if we're doing sort of long-term monitoring to see who's who. There's some more headshots. You see the male in the middle there, quite distinctive. They've also got amazing red eyes. So, a bit about their ecology then. So they're ambush predators, feeding on mammals, sometimes birds, but reptiles and amphibians. Some of their favourite items are field voles, I think that's a bank vole actually possibly, and then common lizard. Traditionally people have thought they tend to live for sort of 8 to 10 years, but there was a chap in Dorset who studied populations on 2 really sensitively managed sites, and that's quite important I think, where the same individuals being recorded repeatedly over a period of 30 years, so they can be really long-lived in the right conditions. So right now they're probably heading into hibernation. In early spring, so February, March kind of time, depending on the year, individuals will emerge and spend time lying out for for an extended period of time, which is essentially a way of building up energy after their long hibernation. And if you ever go for a walk in the early spring and find lots of adders together, you've probably stumbled across a hibernacular, which is what we call the site where they actually spend that hibernation period. The males will emerge first in order to get enough energy to battle each other and display and all this sort of thing, once the females come out a couple of weeks later. The females then give birth to live young towards the end of the summer. So yeah, they're live young, so that's the species is viviparous, much like the common lizard and the slow worm, which are also the 3 species that do well in the cold northern climates we have in the North Pennines, because they don't have to lay eggs, they can just bask and get that energy to incubate their young internally. So yeah, as I said, they're sort of going back down into hibernation at this time of year. They can come out during the winter, but obviously there's not much energy in the sun during those winter months, so it's a bit of a risky manoeuvre for them, but they can be even seen moving across the snow. So if you're familiar with the North Pennines, you might actually recognise some of these places. These are just some shots of places you might be looking for adders. So heathland, woodland edge, mosaics of, complexity is key with adders, as with many species, but these are sort of the typical places you might be looking. So rocky outcrops, quarries where there's a mosaic of habitats, scrub regeneration, grassland, exposed rock, heathland. Some more photos there. Stone walls. When you build a dry stone wall, you sort of dig a trench at the base there and put in large foundation stones, and between those is often a good gap which is beneath the surface of the ground, so it's slightly warmer than the surrounding area. It stays stable, that's the most important thing through the winter, so they can actually form really, really fantastic hibernacular features, and also they're quite good in terms of landscape connectivity because the snakes can move along them without the risk of getting predated in the open by crows and buzzards and foxes and stoats and things like that. You'll also see them using rabbit warrens and vole burrows for hibernacular. Difficulty mode is increased on this one. It's another spot their adder. There she is. So really amazing camouflage, especially in bracken. If you imagine sort of dead bracken litter at this time of year, it's pretty perfect camouflage. You do get your eye in for finding them when you do lots of surveys. So this is some footage from a really passionate volunteer called Adam Moan, who does a lot of surveying in the North Pennines. This is amazing bit of footage here, and it's something that you might well not have seen before, some courting behaviour. So you can see the male approaching there. I should say this was taken from a reasonable distance away using a really good zoom lens, which is always a good idea to avoid disturbing them, because they are quite sensitive to disturbance, as we'll talk about in a bit. I just love these videos, seeing the locomotion. It's so different to any mammal or anything else, really, isn't it? It's quite something watching them move. And you see the male's tail there, what we were saying earlier about the difference in the tail shapes. So this is the adder dance, as it's known sometimes. This isn't sped up, if you can believe it. So this happens in early spring. You'll be really lucky to see this behaviour, but if you do, enjoy the spectacle. You can't tell which is which after all, can you? So when they're doing this, they're chock full of hormones, and they often don't perceive hazards around them. So the chap who filmed this has had them go across the footpath in front of him. They're doing this out in the open with buzzards around. You know, they're so focused on basically winning the right to court the females. And that's actually copulation happening there. But this is an interesting video because you'll see a competing male arrive on the scene shortly. So this is a male displaying guarding behaviour. You see the female's tail is quite different there. That's quite a good demonstration of the two shapes next to each other. As I said before, it's fascinating watching the locomotion. The way they move is it's quite mesmerising, really, which you can see why they sort of captured people's imagination and have influenced our mythology and culture. This guy's not happy. So that displaying behaviour there, it's quite amazing, isn't it? So although he's done a good job there, polyandry is actually quite common in adders, and sometimes the females will have clutches with different sires, as it were. You don't have to read the text there if you don't want to. So this is just a quote from a National Amphibian Reptile Survey that was carried out. It was a big, widespread recording scheme. The takeaway is that of the more widespread reptile species, so not including sand lizard and smooth snake, which are sort of restricted to a sort of specific locations, of the main sort of widespread species, adders were by far the rarest, and the data shows that they are declining. And the report actually suggested that they're now vulnerable to extinction in England, which is urgent, to say the least. So what are the threats to the conservation of adders? Disturbance, we talked about this before. Much like wading birds on the seashore, if a dog chases them and puts them up in the air in the winter, then that owner of that dog might think it's harmless because they settle again afterwards. But if that happens all day, every day, all through the winter, and they're also having to deal with harsh weather and just getting battered by storms and things, is really going to reduce their ability to survive. So likewise with adders, particularly in the summer when the females are gravid, the more times they have to move out of that basking spot, the more times they get stressed, the more likely they are to fail to raise young, essentially. Well, not raise them, they don't raise them, but they have a successful clutch of young. There's also persecution, so misunderstanding and fear is a big issue with adders. Unfortunately, they still get persecuted. People think that they're a threat to their children or their pets or themselves, and they feel a responsibility to remove them from their habitat, as it were, which is a real tragedy, and it's an issue of education. Changes in land use, management practices, development, habitat loss, intensification of agriculture in the lowlands, these are all reasons. Adders' range may have reduced over the last few decades. and isolation, which comes as a result of all those things. So genetic diversity, inability to disperse through the landscape. Yeah. So again, I'll just quickly summarise. This is from a large-scale study called Make the Adder Count, which contributed data from 260 sites all across the UK, and it confirmed a significant decline on average across all sites with small populations. So that's populations with kind of a handful of individuals, which unfortunately is about 90% of the populations that we have. The larger populations were weakly increasing, but to me that suggests that on a landscape scale the population is not resilient at the moment, and the report suggests that if the trends continue, within 15 to 20 years adders will be restricted to only those large population sites and therefore functionally extinct in a lot of the country. And that report was published in 2019, so that's already 5 years ago. So this is from an earlier report associated with the same study. Habitat management was frequently reported to be affecting populations both in a positive and negative manner, but the most frequently reported negative factor was disturbance from public pressure. That's disturbance of the adders themselves, not the habitats. So that's almost half of the sites were being impacted by irresponsible use or just accidental disturbance. Don't worry too much about the colours and the shapes of these dots. They just refer to the years and the source of the data. But this is pretty much the distribution we know about at the moment from citizen science, various recording efforts. It's quite an interesting pattern. It sort of does align with population centres and hotspots for walking and things. But there are huge areas of suitable habitat all down the western side of the Pennines in Walkup and Morehouse and up in Teesdale and places. So we'd love to do some formal surveys over there and establish whether the species is actually absent from those places or not, or whether it's just because they're really remote and people don't, there's low footfall and people don't record them. But it's an interesting overview of where we are in the North Pennines as it stands. But hopefully towards the end of the project we'll have lots more dots and lots more of an idea of where things are. So what can we actually do? Hibernacula are an obvious thing that you can do to help. It's not the ideal situation. Adders also need foraging areas and a sensitively managed landscape. But hibernacula is something quite engaging. People can build one and they can get excited about it. So what are they? They're sheltered features, usually with an underground component. So it provides stable temperatures through the winter. There could be log piles, dry stone walls, as we mentioned, root systems and rabbit warrens. And we can actually make them ourselves by just digging a shallow scrape, not too deep so it pulls water, and infill with kind of big rubble that you might use, the size of stone you might use for walling, logs, things like that, to create lots of cavities and voids, cover it back over, and that creates an amazing habitat resource, which is also great for amphibians and small mammals and invertebrates and things as well. There's some examples. So this was from a design guide put together by the Mendip Hills National Landscape. They also had a project on adders. So how to manage land sensitively, briefly, I don't want to run over, but so carry out vegetation clearance in the winter when they're dormant to maintain a mosaic. So complexity is what I was talking about before. The more complex the mosaic of habitats and the different structures and heights, the better, essentially. Avoid overstocking, particularly with sheep, which graze quite aggressively and create a uniform short sward. You can use sheep to manage land sensitively, but you have to adjust the stocking densities appropriately. Prevent disturbance is quite important. Maintain those corridors through the more managed, intensively farmed areas, so those hedgerows and dry stone walls. I'll not go into it too much, but reduce game bird pressure if you can as well. Pheasants anecdotally have been proven to have a really detrimental impact on all of our native herpetofauna, which is amphibians and reptiles. They predate the juveniles and just peck at the heads of the adults as a kind of threat response, and millions of them are released into the British countryside every year, so they do have a big impact. How can you get involved? We run loads of volunteer surveys at the North Pennines National Landscape, not only in this project but in lots of other projects as well, in all sorts of different fields. So I would really encourage people to check out the website and see what opportunities are available. If you can't make it to any of those, that's absolutely fine. Please, when you're out and about, do submit your records to iRecord, iNaturalist, or email me directly, just with your name and the location and the date. You don't have to take a photo. That's why we like iRecord. You don't have to submit photos with your records. We'd rather you didn't disturb the adder than you try to get close to it and scare it off. If you leave and it's still in the same place as where you found it, that's a win. And then also, try to keep dogs on leads in sort of hot spots or on the heathlands and woodland edges and scrubby areas, particularly in the middle of summer when they're most sensitive. So I hope you've been interested in that. Hope it was enjoyable. Don't know if there are any questions or if that was for later on.